on about climate change on the show. With the COP27 summit taking place in Egypt. Just Stop Oil protesters causing disruption on the M25 this week. It's something that hasn't really hit us in terms of the disruption and the protests in this part of the world. Lots of stories in the papers, though, where you see members of the public being angry about their journey being delayed because of protests or anger over artwork being vandalised, all sorts of stuff going on. So I'm talking yesterday about whether or not we should be listening to the Just Stop Oil protesters rather than feeling anger and frustration towards them. Some of you said that people aren't thinking about their children and grandchildren who'll suffer if we don't start thinking about the planet. Dave said, why are we outraged at a tin of soup being thrown at an old painting, but we happily pollute and destroy the climate around us? More of you were questioning who the protesters are. Robert asked if the protesters use heating and electricity. It's double standards if they do. Some of you asked how they get to the protests. Do they go by car? A few of you went on to say they're not normal people, whatever that means. They're middle class, they're rich, they live in big houses. They drive SUVs, they're disrupting the lives of normal working folk. So I thought, how can we find out? Let's talk to one. Stephanie Golder is a spokesperson for Just Stop Oil. Stephanie, good morning. Thanks for coming on to BBC Radio Stoke. First of all, what do you say to people who say you're hypocrites because you're still using heating or electricity or you drive a car?
Morning, Stuart. Thanks so much for having me. Firstly, I'm 35. I work for a poverty charity, so I absolutely understand the impacts of the cost of living on ordinary people, and I'm absolutely furious with our government. In terms of whether we're hypocrites, I think we can nitpick about our hypocrisies all day, but it's removing the onus on government to support people to live less carbon-heavy lives, and that's through things like home insulation, green heating policies, better public transport. And of course, we should try our best within our income, our time, our knowledge to change our lifestyle, but this isn't about individual change. We aren't asking people to change. We're not asking people to buy an electric car or go vegan, and we're not judging those who can't. What we're doing is asking the government to implement policy and act accordingly, because this is an emergency and they are not acting like it at the moment.
So why are you disrupting people's lives if you're not asking them to change?
So our demand is for the government to cancel and refuse all new fossil fuel licences and explorations, and that is not a radical ask. And the government are acting criminally by greenlighting over 100 projects. And the UN, the International Energy Agency, expert scientists have all said this is madness. So I feel like we have a duty to resist, and big polluters are raking in billions of pounds while people go hungry in this country. I think that's a disgrace. We have a crisis of greed, and to be honest, what we're doing is a proportionate response to what's happening. Our entire food system is so close to collapse, and I'm absolutely terrified, to be honest. And this week we've had the United Nations Secretary General saying that we are on a highway to climate hell. Now, what do we do now at this point? Where else do we go?
But one of the arguments that we had on the programme yesterday, one of the discussions was whether your actions are working in your favour or your cause's favour or against. When the stories in the media about ambulances not being able to get through, people not being able to get to work, people not being able to get to hospital, is it working in your favour or against you at the moment, some of the protests that are going on, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not a popularity contest, and we're not trying to get people on our side. We're trying to force the government to act. What I would ask you back is, why aren't journalists telling people how bad this is at the moment? People need to know. And, they don't know, I don't think. I don't think they realise how bad things are going to get. And of course, we feel awful about the impact on people, and they have an absolute right to be angry. It's not something that we choose to do lightly at all, but we shouldn't be having to do it. We've got failure of leadership, a failure of politics, and it's pushed us into a corner. So, I agree that the acts we're having to take are unacceptable, and we are accountable for that. If there was a better way, we would do it.
Just for the record, and I suspect you weren't listening yesterday, why would you have been, Stephanie? But we did have an expert in sustainability on for 10 minutes talking about the state of the planet and where we are at the moment. In terms of the people, one of the things that some listeners seem to be quite hung up on is you've told us who you are and what you do, but this idea that protesters, Just Stop Oil protesters particularly, are just middle-class, rich people who don't work. Who is out there causing these protests? What kind of people are part of your organisation?
Yeah, I don't think that argument holds up at all, to be honest. I think it's a trope that's used to discredit us.
So you don't take a break for hummus and carrot sticks every couple of hours then?
No. I mean, I like hummus, sure. But no, I mean, I've sat on the road, I've blocked roads, I've done it with climate scientists and doctors, but I've also done it with paramedics and builders. Personally, when I was growing up, my mum worked nights at a petrol station. My dad was a milkman. I was the first in my family to go to uni. I work for a small charity. I don't, it's a real mixed bag of people. But of course, you have to have a certain level of privilege to be able to do what we do. I absolutely agree with that. So for me, I don't have kids. I can book annual leave. So it's my duty to take action as a more privileged person. And more people like me do need to step up.
What about what some would say is extremes of protesting that have gone on? People who at one point tied themselves onto one of the bridges that crosses the Thames on the M25, for example, closing the motorway for a significant length of time. Is that okay?
I think at the moment, we're just trying everything. We really don't know what's going to work. This has never been done before. And we are furious, we are frustrated, we are frightened. And if we look throughout history, there's always been disruptive protests. The suffragettes caused a great deal of damage. They were disruptive. They went to prison. I think we forget about that a lot. In the 90s, disabled activists chained themselves to buses. So, action has to be controversial. It has to happen in a public space to create conversation. And I wouldn't be here talking to you now if we hadn't have taken some of those acts.
Is it reasonable to expect governments to stop buying, using, looking for oil, given how dependent we are at the moment on it?
I mean, they have to. This is the thing, is that they have to. And we're not asking for oil to stop now. We understand that this is going to be a transition, and we want to keep jobs. We want to make sure people have work. We want to make sure that the poor aren't affected. But we don't have a choice. This is something that, like I said, the International Energy Agency, expert scientists, the IPCC have all said that we cannot have any new fossil fuels. And instead, we should be ploughing money into renewables. We should looking for alternatives. But at the moment, we're not. And we're not taxing those big polluters enough. And we could be using that fund to build a better future, a greener future.
This has just come in from COP27. The Chinese climate envoy on fossil fuel emissions has said we should have renewable capacity in place before we give up older energy sources. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, we have to, right? Of course we do. And we need to get going now. We should have done it 10 years ago, really. We should have started building that infrastructure then. So, yeah, of course, we can't just stop oil without the infrastructure being in place to transition. But that also needs to go alongside a level of decarbonisation. So we've also been asking for home insulation, cheaper public transport, better public transport, so people don't need to use their cars so much. There's all these policies that are pretty, they're not radical policies that we should be doing, so we use less energy, and then it will make it easier for us to transition to renewables.
Clive says, I'm just wondering if any of the older protesters are or have made substantial profits for their pensions from the exploitation of oil and the massive profits they make there.
I don't know, to be honest. Again, a problem is that our pensions are tied up into fossil fuels. Our banking is tied up into fossil fuels, our food system. We're absolutely, we're not, we know this. And that's one of the reasons why we're acting, because it's making a lot of money for a small amount of people while the rest of us struggle. So we need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and find a better way.
You might want a pen for this to write it down for a banner. Doom-mongering, tofu-chomping middle-class lefties is how one listener's described your group.
That's original, yeah. I mean, I like tofu. It's great.
Are you doom-mongering?
No, I don't think we are. And we hear that one a lot. And you know what? People have a lot to worry about. And I understand that, people aren't going to want to take this on board. It's really frightening when you start reading into it. So I understand if you're trying to just put food on your table, if you're trying to just go to work and pay your rent, you don't want to think about what's going on. But if you read the science, like the IPCC report, for example, what we're looking at is shocking. Like I said, our entire food system is so close to collapse. 3,000 extra people died during the summer heatwave in this country. That's really scary. If you've got elderly relatives, we're going to see that year on year now. That shouldn't be happening.
This just in as well. Police motorcyclists been hurt in a collision involving two lorries at a rolling roadblock on the M25 amid climate protests that have closed parts of the motorway, and two people have been arrested for causing a public nuisance. What's your feeling about you and other protesters being arrested for saying how you feel?
It's not something that we take lightly. No one wakes up in the morning and thinks, hey, I really want to go to prison. It's not fun at all. We're not doing it for fame, but, it's something at the moment that we've been forced to do because we've tried all the legal avenues. I've been involved in climate activism for the past probably over a decade now. I've done marches, I've done writing to my MP, I stood for councillor in my local area. I've done all the things that everyone tells us to do. So we're forced to go for more sort of outrageous acts that unfortunately are illegal and often imprisonable, and we are held fully accountable for that.
Mike in Eccleshall says, I believe there's an obvious way to deal with climate change. You control population. It's an overpopulated planet. Reduce the population. That will help. It's the only way. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's actually a bit of a racist myth, that one, because how do we control the population? It's not something that I feel that I should be able to comment on, but, from Just Stop Oil, it's not something that we talk about. But how do you control the population?
Well, can we just explore it a little, though? Because in terms of the population and the use of the resources of the planet, I think I'm right in saying that we as individuals in the West, to use that term, use significantly more resources than people in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So it's not an equal balancing act in terms of the actual number of people, is it?
Absolutely. And what I find frustrating with that population argument is that it usually does talk about people in countries like Africa, and it talks about people having lots of children in countries like Africa, when, of course, their carbon footprint is very, very, very minute in compared to us in this country. And there are actually people in this country, like myself, who are choosing not to have children because we don't want to add any more consumers to this planet. So, I think it's wrong to talk about population when it comes to poorer countries because they do not have the footprint that we have here.
I've got so many questions coming in. Are you all right taking questions from listeners on this? We'll see where we go. Would you still protest if a protest meant you needed to get to hospital to see a family member on life support, but you couldn't get through because protesters were in the way? How would you feel about that?
It's such a difficult question, isn't it? Because I'm sure I would feel devastated and I would be rightly angry. And, we absolutely understand that people do feel like that. I hope I never have to be put into that position. But I do blame the government for putting people into that position because we shouldn't have to be blocking roads. We've been forced to do that.
Badger says, do you realise that when you pull these stunts and protests, that due to your actions, the traffic congestion and jams it causes means that more oil, diesel and petrol is being used while people sit in traffic?
I've heard that one before. It's in terms of what we're trying to do, in terms of our demand, which is no new oil and gas. I think it's very minute, the type of pollution that we're talking about.
Tim in Trentham says, for every expert that you have to call upon, there's another one who will dispute it. How big a problem is that?
I don't think that's true at all. I think we've got thousands and thousands of experts, climate scientists who are telling us the truth. And there's always going to be a small number of contrarians that are possibly in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry that are trying to discredit that type of science. And we've seen that for the past 30, 40 years, that's been happening.
OK. I'll throw this one in from Lee. Well done, girl. I hope that's not patronising. This young lady speaks with a lot of sense. If we don't take action, we are doomed. Governments aren't pushing it through, as it will hurt us whilst we change to renewables, and people aren't happy.
Thank you. Yeah.
You'll take that one.
That's great, yeah.
I wonder if this is the nub of kind of where we were yesterday when we were talking about this, and I'm grateful for you coming on and fielding these questions for us. Robert from Norton says he disagrees with you and says lots of people he knows are sick of the protests, they're sick of the protesters, they're causing disruption and affecting normal people's lives. Is that a concern among you and the Just Stop Oil protesters, that actually you're turning people off your argument rather than drawing people towards it?
Not really. I mean, like I said, this isn't a popularity contest. We're not trying to get people on our side. You've had organisations like Greenpeace who are doing, awareness raising over the past 30 years, and it's got us nowhere. So we're kind of past that point where we're trying to bring people on board with us. We obviously want to build our movement, and there are always going to be a number of people who already feel like we do and will join us, and that's great. But I know that there's always going to be, the same amount of people who are not going to be engaged with that, and that's fine. We're not trying to bring them on board. We're trying to force the government to change.
Is that the fundamental problem here? You're saying it's not a popularity contest. Politics is, and they need the votes, and making difficult decisions that maybe the public won't like. By the sound of it, and please correct me if I've got this wrong, in order to meet carbon neutrality, if you like, not pumping pollution into the atmosphere in a way that the planet can't control and manage and keep us sustainable, we're going to have to see a change and potentially a drop in our standard of living, aren't we? And that's a really hard sell for a government.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think, yes, we will have to change the way we live to some respect. Absolutely, we do. But then we have to think about, why should we be allowed to consume as much as we want here with no limits when you've got 33 million people in Pakistan who have been displaced because of floods? Our consumption in this country is helping to cause some of that extreme weather in other poorer countries. So where do we draw the line and say that we actually have to change so other people can have a chance at a good life?
Dan, who is a scientist and very interested in the climate and the environment, says surely the doom mongers are those people who turn a blind eye to the mounting climate catastrophe. And as for population control, yes, control those who emit the most, and it won't be the poor of the developing world. When do we start that?
Yeah, I don't feel qualified to answer that question about population.
Well, no, but you've already expressed that you've chosen not to have children. So for some individuals, they are making that choice. Catherine in Stafford says we live in a democracy. We're all entitled to freedom of speech. Loads of other comments, but I can't keep you too much longer. I just wanted to ask you this before I let you get on. What does it feel like when you're sitting in the middle of a road blocking traffic?
It's frightening, it's nerve-wracking, but it also makes you feel like you're quite powerful as one individual. And we work in a team, so that feeling of community is really strong as well. We're really supportive of each other. And I must say as well, I know there's a lot, we talk a lot about how the public doesn't support us, but when you're sitting on a road, I would say that 80% of people that I speak to do support us. The problem is they are frightened to vocalise that. So the angry ones are the loudest always, and the ones that disagree are the loudest. But on the street, on the road, they come up to us, they pat us on the back, they say, well done, thank you. And I hear that more than I hear the angry voices actually on the road.
And finally, what will make you stop?
As soon as the government commit to our simple demand, no new oil and gas, and we will go home. I can't wait, to be honest. I wish they'd hurry up. I'd love to get on with my life.
It's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me, Stuart. Take care.
Bye-bye now. That's
Bye.
Stephanie Golder from Just Stop Oil, the group that's causing issues on the road network, particularly in London and the South East at the moment. I thought it was fascinating just hearing from someone who's been there, done it, and can speak with some authority about what it's like to be a protester. Your thoughts on what you've heard this morning? 0800 121 8080.